When we think about translating ancient texts, it's so easy to picture it like a simple math equation, right? Just swap one ancient word for one modern word, and boom, you've got a translation. But actually, it is way more thrilling than that. In this explainer, we're not looking at translation as some boring word-for-word substitution. No, we're framing it as an active, high-stakes forensic investigation. We're literally putting on our detective hats today to see how translators reconstruct entire invisible worlds. And this whole investigation really hinges on one core principle from Dr. George Payton. He says, we can't translate what we don't understand. Now, that sounds incredibly simple, doesn't it? But the implications are absolutely massive. Interpreters have to completely crack the underlying meaning, the hidden assumptions, and the whole cultural context of a scene before they can even think about changing the words into another language. Without a quality interpretation, a quality translation is just utterly impossible. So, here is our case file for today. We're going to start by shattering the illusion of translation, figure out how to mind the communication gap, and unpack the translator's ultimate toolkit. After that, we'll head out for some actual field work, cracking Old Testament codes and decoding New Testament context, before finally delivering our verdict. Let's dive right into that first file, the illusion of translation. Think about your own everyday conversations for a second. Dr. Payton uses these totally relatable family examples to prove that, honestly, we all basically speak in code. If you're sitting at the dinner table and someone says, "There's no salt on the table," they are definitely not just stating a scientific observation of fact. The actual hidden meaning is, "Hey, please get up and pass the salt." Or say you tell your spouse, "We're out of milk," and they reply, "I'll go by the store." You just communicated a complete set of instructions without either of you ever uttering the literal words, "Please go buy milk." We communicate intentions that go way, way beyond the literal words we say out loud. Which brings us to a massive hurdle in our detective work, the communication gap. We call this cryptic communication. It's essentially what happens when an author just assumes their audience completely understands their shared cultural or historical background, so they leave critical information entirely unsaid. And these unspoken assumptions, they create really dangerous gaps in ancient texts. For translators, this is an absolute minefield. The biggest challenge isn't just knowing your ancient Greek or Hebrew vocabulary, it's spotting the gaps that aren't even there on the page. If a translator isn't actively hunting for these invisible gaps, they are going to completely miss the true message. So, how exactly do they find them? Well, it's time to open up the translator's toolkit. Every good detective needs a solid interrogation strategy, right? To get a helicopter view of an ancient scene, translators have to fire off the classic 5 W's and an H. Who did the action? What happened? Where is it happening? When did it happen? Why did they do it? And how did it happen? They use these questions to build a full 3D mental picture of the cultural setting, the history, and the physical environment. If they ask one of these questions and the answer is, I don't know, then boom, they found a communication gap. They absolutely must answer these questions before translating a single word. Let's look at a fascinating concept from this toolkit called the dictic center. Just think of it like a video camera that stays locked onto the main character. Dr. Payton shared this incredible discovery from translating African folktales. You see, in certain languages, the main character is referred to with pronouns like he or she throughout the entire story, while only the minor characters get repeatedly called by their actual names. So if a translator reads a Greek text and translates it literally as, "Jesus did this, Jesus did that, Jesus said this," they might accidentally be demoting Jesus to a minor character in that target language. No way, right? To keep him as the focus of the camera, the dictic center, they actually have to use pronouns instead. All right, let's take these tools out into the field and start cracking some Old Testament codes. If you read the first 9 verses of Genesis 14 from a modern Western perspective, it sounds a bit crazy, like the same armies go out to fight each other twice. But comparing Western storytelling to Hebrew literary structure clears this up instantly. Western storytelling usually moves in a chronological, step-by-step sequence, A, then B, then C. But ancient Hebrew literature? It often drops a general summary preamble right at the top, kind of like a headline for the whole episode. Then, it circles back and fills in the backstory and the juicy details. So the kings didn't actually fight the same battle twice. The author was just giving us the headline before diving into the full article. As we keep reading that story, the text simply says the kings rebelled. Now, in English, rebellion probably makes you picture angry peasants with pitchforks taking to the streets. But remember, translators have to build the whole scenario. Let's unpack the real cultural weight behind that one single word. In the ancient Eastern geopolitical system, rebelling specifically meant a vassal king refusing to pay their mandatory yearly tribute, their taxes, to the ruling king who had conquered them. Just understanding that one single concept completely explains why massive armies are suddenly marching across the map. And here's where Dr. Payton issues a massive warning. Treat pronouns as crime scenes. Seriously, he tells translators to circle them in red and write danger all around them. For example, in Genesis 14, verse 10, the text says they fell into the tar pits and they fled to the hills. But who exactly is they? By carefully tracking who that pronoun refers to, we keep the literary focus exactly where it belongs, on the fleeing armies of Sodom and Gomorrah. Even though 5 whole kings fought in this battle, the author zeroes the camera lens squarely on Sodom. Why? Because that's where Abraham's nephew Lot lives, and that detail drives the entire rest of the story. Let's fast forward a bit and try decoding some highly contextual New Testament scenes. Over in Mark chapter 9, Jesus speaks really figuratively, telling the crowd that the prophesied Elijah has already come, which was actually a reference to John the Baptist. So why didn't he just explain this directly? Well, look at the historical timeline. The audience had Isaiah's prophecies 700 years prior, then Malachi's final words 400 years prior, and then 400 years of complete prophetic silence. Everyone in that crowd was utterly pumped, just waiting for the Messiah to show up. Jesus' audience knew this massive historical gap intimately. Translators have to realize the crowds were totally primed to understand these figurative, unspoken connections between John the Baptist and Elijah.
A bit later in Mark 9, Jesus sees an argument and asks, "What are you discussing with them?" And there are those dangerous pronouns again. Who is you and who is them? Some commentators assume Jesus was publicly calling out his own disciples. But Dr. Payton uses his decades of living in African honor cultures to solve this one. In Eastern and African honor cultures, calling someone out publicly, especially your own followers, is just deeply shameful. You simply don't do it. Because of that cultural reality, Jesus almost certainly wouldn't shame his disciples in public, meaning the them in his question was the arguing crowd. The cultural scenario dictates the translation.
Then, in verse 20, we hit the phrase, when he saw him, which is immediately followed by a boy convulsing. Okay, who saw who? In the original Greek text, there are no capital letters to help us out. But here is an amazing grammatical clue. The word for spirit in Greek, pneuma, can be a neuter noun, so it aligns grammatically with the pronoun. By looking at both the grammar and the physical scenario, we realize it was actually the evil spirit inside the boy that saw Jesus. And that is what caused the spirit to throw the boy into a convulsion. It wasn't Jesus seeing the spirit. Finally, a desperate father comes up and asks Jesus to heal his son, if you can. And Jesus replies, if you can? Now, you have to ask, is Jesus harshly rebuking this poor, grieving father? Well, the surrounding context of the whole chapter is all about an unbelieving generation. So reading this phrase as a rhetorical question meant for impact, like a gentle but profound challenge, perfectly connects to that overarching theme of belief versus unbelief. Translators have to capture that exact nuanced tone, not just swap out the raw words. So, with all that evidence, what is the final verdict on our detective work today? It really comes down to this. Translators don't translate words, sentences, or even paragraphs. They translate entire scenarios. True translation is this incredible art of stepping back into that helicopter, answering the 5 W's and an H, and completely rebuilding the invisible world behind the text. They do all of this so that a modern reader can finally step inside the scene and truly understand what was meant, not just what was technically said. Which leaves us with one final provocative thought. If ancient texts are this wildly rich with unspoken meaning, how much invisible cultural context is hiding behind the words you read, text, and speak every single day? It really makes you think, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, keep your eyes peeled for those invisible gaps, and we will see you next time.